Hello and good day. How are you today, Phil?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Great. Yeah, thanks for taking the time out today. Today's session will be focused on healthcare innovation, and specifically, will healthcare organizations be more or less innovative in a post-COVID, post-pandemic world? I have Phil Gibbs with me today to talk a little bit more about this and give some of his thoughts, share some of his thoughts on this new world we're living in and navigating. Phil is the founding principal of the Disruption Lab, an innovation and growth lab that equips executives to invent the future, with emphasis on healthcare innovation through Lab 2025. The Lab 2025 Innovation Academy is a 6-month cohort that brings together executives and clinicians to study innovation in 5 leading centers for innovation in the United States, plus Singapore, a global benchmark for innovation. Early in his career, Phil worked at the large Oak Ridge, Tennessee complex, including the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. The consulting firm he founded and led for over a decade, Executive Learning, Inc., was one of the country's leading change agents focused on continual improvement, particularly in healthcare, and included work with industry leader HCA and the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. He has co-founded multiple companies, including eSpaces and LifeFiles, and as a principal in an early-stage investment firm, he evaluated investment opportunities and served on boards of multiple portfolio companies. Phil holds a doctorate from The Ohio State University, where his interest in innovation began with his dissertation research focused on how organizations achieve both high productivity and high innovation. Again, welcome, Phil, and I appreciate the time today.
Thanks very much, and thanks for saying The Ohio State University. I appreciate that.
Had to get that right. So diving into our session today, again, topic, will healthcare organizations be more or less innovative in a post-COVID, post-pandemic world? So innovation has seemed to speed up, at least in some areas related to the pandemic. But when we emerge on the other side of the pandemic, should we expect healthcare organizations to be more or less innovative, and why?
Yeah, I think that's really a fascinating question, because there have been a lot of innovations that have sped up as we've entered and gone through the various stages of the pandemic. Certainly things like telehealth have sped up, moving care outside of normal care delivery sites to homes and other sites. And it's happening outside of healthcare as well. We certainly know that working from home is an innovation that has been accelerated. Home delivery of food has been accelerated. Obviously, Zoom meetings and moving from meeting in person to technology-enabled meetings. So all sorts of innovations that were already underway have sped up. But the extent to which the acceleration of innovation will continue once we get through the major part of the pandemic is just a really interesting question to think about. And my expectation is it'll pull back, at least to some extent. One framework that I use to kind of think about this is called force field analysis. And what it says is we're at a particular equilibrium because there are forces pushing for change and there are forces pushing back against, and we reach equilibrium where we are because those forces match. So before the pandemic, there were all sorts of forces pushing for change in healthcare. Certainly things like cost. I think the cost somewhere around $11,000 per person in the country, approaching 20% of the economy. Things like medical errors, which account for perhaps the third ranking cause of death in the US. Just the difficulty of access and the complexity of the system. Those were all pushing for change already. And then here comes this major force called COVID-19. And all of a sudden, we're all innovators, we're all collaborators, and we're looking for opportunities to make changes and to make them quickly. It was no longer okay to say no. We were much more open to saying yes, and the territorialism that often hampers innovation was gone. We were all working together to make change. So we've accelerated the innovation, but now as we move into, and we're not there yet, but as we start moving out of the pandemic, The question is, will those forces that have been there all the time start really pushing back, and we maybe pull back a little bit and at least be at a point where we're not accelerating at the point we are now. So what I think we have to think about post pandemic is we're going to have the same leadership, we're going to have the same organizations, the same structure. We will have learned a lot through the process, and we've seen what's possible. But the real question is, will we be able to continue the acceleration? And the other thing I think we have to think about is we've experienced loss, and we've had some failures, which may make us less risk uh, willing to take risk as we move forward. So I think it's an open question, and it may actually be the leadership challenge of the next decade: is can we take in healthcare the lessons that we've learned through the pandemic and the unusual circumstance we've been in, the real acceleration, the movement that we've experienced, and apply that in a non-crisis mode.
Yeah, I mean, great points. I mean, that definitely rings true from my perspective, just working at a healthcare provider organization and dealing with the pandemic and all the challenges and the rapid pace that we had to move to adjust and respond to the pandemic, and then also the kind of recovery on the backside, just to stabilize our business. So I think you're right. I think the lessons learned from this, it will be interesting to see how leadership teams across the spectrum of healthcare, all the different sectors, how they, like you said, apply those and what that means for the future. So with that being said, it kind of leads me to my next question. What is going to be required of these healthcare organizations to actually become more innovative to meet these new challenges in a post-COVID world?
Yeah, I think when things are uncertain like they are in the world we're in today, just going back to basics is probably the critical thing to be sure that we're innovative. The temptation will be is to say we had a lot of great ideas during the pandemic. Just go and find great ideas and implement the great ideas. And that simply doesn't work. And for one thing, at least in my experience, great ideas are almost always wrong. And they seem like great ideas on the front end, but once you get into it, I've never been involved in a early stage company that when you get into it, start working with the concept, the idea, it doesn't end up being something different than when you started with. I think that applies in corporate environments, in every environment. So, and what happens sometimes is when we focus on just coming up with great ideas, we get distracted from other things that may be much greater opportunities. One of the, I think, real great things that's come out of the pandemic is a call to focus on science. Now, sometimes in this whole process, we have confused attaching data and numbers to things as being science, and that's really not science. But the focus on instead of starting with a great idea and innovation, is starting with a hypothesis that leads to experimentation. And that sounds like that's not the language that we typically use. But you had mentioned Singapore, and I recall being in Singapore with Dr. Stephen Chan at the Woodlands Health Campus, and he talked about when we asked a couple of questions, instead of saying, well, our approach is, or what we do, or what we need to do, his response, it was, well, the hypothesis is, it's a way of thinking, it's a basic to a scientific approach to innovation. So it's going back to a focus on experimentation, which is at the core of innovation, is doing rapid experimentation, doing it quickly, doing it inexpensively, That's one of the core elements. Another thing is just to think about the type of innovation that is going to be applied. Are you talking about technology innovation? Or are you talking about business model innovation? And our tendency today is to be drawn and just totally focused on technology. And certainly you mentioned the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and all of the technology around the country and in healthcare in particular that draws us and seems to dominate in a lot of cases. But it's really the integration of technology into new business models and new ways of delivering care. We have to go back and decide what is going to be our basic approach to innovation. And there are different models. There's the Toyota model of 1,000,000 ideas and implementing over 90% of the ideas. There's the Amazon approach, which is a lot of new major initiatives and disruptive innovation. And maybe it's both. I think you were with us when we visited Mayo Clinic and we talked about the many projects that they have going. And they talked about their focus is on is 75% of the projects are strategic projects. So it's a real focus on doing big things. And every healthcare organization has to decide, how are we going to approach innovation? What's our objective? Are we trying to improve efficiency? Take cost out of the system? Are we trying to add features so that we can charge more money? Are we trying to grow the business and move the needle? So it's going back to all of those basics, getting a real foundation in science, experimentation, rapid experimentation, deciding how we're going to approach it, whether it's just a lot of small improvements or major steps forward or a combination of both of those. And what is the core thing we're trying to accomplish? Take cost out, add to revenue, or grow the business. Those are basic elements, and those are the things that are going to determine whether organizations going forward are really more innovative or less innovative.
Yeah, no, it's a great feedback, great response. You know, that's one thing that at least I've seen in some of the organizations we studied and explored, and just some general learning. You know, a lot of the organizations really focus on the solution, like how can we solve a problem, but they haven't really defined the problem per se at a deep level and really understand what that problem is. And so, yeah, I think that's something that, you know, from my perspective, organizations are going to really need to kind of figure out, going back to the basics, as you mentioned, and starting from there, starting with the problem and then working their way through the process to actually arrive at the right solution for that problem.
Yeah. And I think, Justin, one of the critical things is, unless there is a systematic approach, the idea that we are going to continue an accelerated rate of innovation is simply not going to work. The force is pushing back a bit against change. You think about the tremendous force of COVID. You take away the tremendous force of COVID, just naturally it's going to move back. So the only way that we're going to keep moving forward, the only way that healthcare organizations are really going to be innovative in the future, if leadership makes decisions to push hard against those natural obstacles, all of the norms, all of the reward system, all of the tendency to say no, or we've always done it this way, or we've got investments in these areas, how can we start focusing over in these areas, are going to cause it to clamp back. So it's going to be really interesting as we come out of it.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, and so kind of building upon that, what types of innovation, you know, do you think will proliferate in healthcare in a post-pandemic world? I mean, you've got your efficiency innovations, you've got your adjacent innovations, you've got your disruptive innovations, your business model innovations. Like, which of those buckets do you see organizations tackling first, or kind of prioritize as a top priority, or is it a little bit of kind of all of those?
Yeah, I think that's the strategic decision that leadership has to make. I don't think it depends on the type of leadership and one's going to be more or less. I tend to think that, as Mayo Clinic has done, we talked about it a little bit earlier, in a rapidly moving environment, just incremental improvement is not adequate. You have to keep doing that. You have to keep improving the core. And that has to be a continuing focus. But you also have to have people focused on moving the needle. One of the major measures of innovation across industries, and we don't think of this much in healthcare, is what percentage of your revenue is from products and services that did not exist 5 years ago or 3 years ago. And we tend not to think of that metric in healthcare. But that tells you, are we changing, moving, growing? Are we simply doing what we've always done? Now, again, technology is so important, and all the clinical advances in pharmaceuticals and data analytics, and all of those are really important. But sometimes they cause us to forget in terms of being healthcare companies and healthcare businesses. How are we thinking strategically? How are we moving forward? Because the life cycles of all the products are just getting shorter and shorter and shorter. So what worked a few years ago is simply not going to work moving forward. We had long time spans to make decisions, to recover if if services weren't continuing to grow, and now those life cycles are getting so short that that simply doesn't work today.
From what I know from some, peers of mine in healthcare, I mean, that decision making and the speed of that decision making is going to be critical in a post-pandemic world. I mean, we can't, sit back and evaluate every single detail of a potential opportunity within our organizations, because by the time you've evaluated and done your due diligence, the idea or the opportunity may have already passed or may have matured or pivoted from there. And so I think,
That's right.
at least again, from what I'm hearing strategically, that decision making, being aligned, being organized, to your point, having a process, makes a lot of sense, and it's really going to get you there quicker, faster, and more effectively. So with that leads me into another question, and I know we talked about doing a little bit of an overview of the corporate innovation canvas. This is a methodology, a process. You guys championed the Disruption Lab, and you guys created. For our listeners today, I'd love to hear more about that, and maybe if you could, share that canvas and kind of talk through some of those steps. I think, this framework, from a process perspective, as we mentioned, is really efficient from what I understand about it, and I think so would go a long way in just enlightening our viewers and our listeners on this process.
Yeah, and some people may be familiar with the concept of a business model canvas. Used to, we would write project plans or business plans, and it would be 50 or 60 pages, and no one would ever read it. But it outlined what you were planning to do, how you were going to approach it. And the business model canvas came along, and it was a one-page way of putting your whole plan, where it could be very visible, could be shared easily, and it gave you a high-level overview of what you were trying to accomplish. So what we have developed is what we call a corporate innovation canvas, and instead of a corporation having to develop a very complex, long, complicated plan for doing innovation, this is an approach for putting the plan on one page. Now, obviously, you can dig deeper or go deeper on each of the segments, but this gives you a real overview. So we call it the corporate innovation canvas. It is divided into blocks, which, once completed, give you an outline of an approach for managing an innovation program within a healthcare organization, or could be used in other types of organizations. What you're looking at here has each of the blocks numbered because it gives you kind of a sequence to go through. In the upper right, you kind of have your whole framework for what you're doing. What's the purpose of the program, your strategy, how are you going to manage the program, and what are the metrics that you're going to use to measure your success? And we'll look at those in just a little bit more depth in just a moment. And then across the bottom, you have the question of funding. How will you source and allocate financial resources to fund innovation? Staffing, how will you secure and allocate human resources to staff innovation? And then training, how will you equip multiple employees and teams to innovate? So that gives you kind of the underlying framework. If you do not have this foundation, you haven't funded it, staffed it, and equipped the people who are going to be doing it, you're unlikely to have a successful innovation initiative. Again, you can't just go implement great ideas. Generally doesn't work. And then kind of the back end side of it is you look at what process you're using for innovation, what process will guide your innovation projects, tools and methods, what tools and methods will you use in the innovation projects, the culture, how will you support a culture of innovation, and then ecosystem, how will you engage with other corporation and startups, which is, as we've seen in visiting cities around the country that are leading centers of innovation in other countries, whether it is in Helsinki or Barcelona or Singapore, a real innovation ecosystem, which really encourages innovation in each of the individual organizations in those ecosystems. Nashville, of course, has a very strong healthcare ecosystem, and enhancing that and supporting the innovation side of it is part of what we're doing Lab 2025. And then at the core of it are the projects. What innovation projects will you do to accomplish your purpose? So this provides a kind of a high level framework for looking at and thinking about an overall innovation program. If you go back and look at the purpose and you think about what is your organization trying to accomplish through innovation, could be a lot of things. Sometimes organizations just do it to motivate, energize employees. It could be increase efficiency and reduce cost in the core of the business, as we talked about earlier. Could be adding features and functions to improve margins, and it could be to grow new products and revenue streams. So if you don't define that purpose up front, then you very well may be off in terms of that your approach you're taking, because they each require different approaches. And then you move to the strategy. How will you accomplish your purpose? Maybe it's digital transformation projects. It could be efficiency in sustaining innovation projects where you're improving existing services that you're offering. You may partner and acquire innovative startups. And for some organizations, that's their total innovation program. They really don't make an attempt to become innovative as an organization, but they simply partner and acquire other organizations. That doesn't really change the culture of the organization, and it doesn't lead to long-term innovation, but it can be a short-term approach. And then there's disruptive and transformative projects that tend to drive growth. And of course, data analytics is becoming more and more critical and underlies the whole process of customer insight. And then you can look at others, like we'll just skip over to the innovation projects, and that's at the core of it. We talked about Toyota, where they do close to 1 million projects, just small projects or ideas that are created. Or you look at major companies like Amazon and other companies, or you go to Mayo Clinic, we talked about earlier, where I believe they've done over the history of their innovation program like 500 projects, and their focus is on strategic projects. But how do you plan, organize, and do the innovation work to accomplish the strategy? You have to charter, fund, and staff the projects, clarify the job to be done, do rapid experiments, that rapid cycle through the scientific method we talked about earlier. And then when validated, you got to transition them out of innovation into operations, or maybe create separate organization to scale the innovation. So that's just a very quick look at a framework for managing the innovation process or program within an organization. There are different ways you can do it. That's one way of thinking about it, looking at it in a very systematic approach.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. And I really like the framework and the methodology, because it really makes you think about all the component parts to the process. As in my past, in my history and experience, you kind of focus on a few of those, but then you kind of not think about some of those other ones, like the culture and pulling those in. Those elements, those are important, right? And if you don't get those right, you might be building something that's not sustainable or scalable, down the road. So I think it's a great, again, a great framework, great canvas, and something that, folks should kind of take a look at and explore a bit deeper, because again, it gives you that 30,000 foot view, and then you can drill down to each of those as, as things mature and evolve for that opportunity. So,
yeah, I think some organizations just like focus on a part of it, like the projects, without thinking about and thinking about how do you train and how do you finance it or fund the projects, who's going to staff it, and maybe you have people just doing it on the side in addition to their full-time jobs, which sometimes you have to do. But looking at all of those, one way I think about it is you start with a whole framework and every block is red. And what you're working to do is turn them all green, because you paid attention to it. You've come up with an approach for each one. And when you turn them all green, then you have a chance of a very successful innovation program in a post-pandemic world, where you're coming out of this very uncertain, kind of crazy time that we're all experiencing. But it gives you a framework to think about, okay, how are we going to move forward? We got pretty innovative during the pandemic. How do we keep it rolling? How do we keep it moving? And that's just a framework for helping organizations think about their innovation moving forward.
That's right. Well, this is great, Phil. Really, again, appreciate the time, the thoughts, the insights related to this. I think, as we said before, time will tell on how organizations, excuse me, in healthcare adapt to this post-pandemic world. And, again, are they going to, pivot to be more of an innovative, future-thinking company, or are they going to kind of revert back to the ways they were pre-COVID? And again, time will tell, and it'll be interesting to see what comes and how that evolves over the coming months and years.
Yeah, totally agree.
Well, with that, we will open it up for some questions. So if you've got some questions, feel free to leave it in the chat. We're going to hop over to a live Q&A session. So we hope to see you all there. Have your questions ready for Phil, and we'll see everyone soon. Thanks for the time.
Thanks.
Take care.